Hello, I'm Elsa Churchill, the genealogist at the Society of Genealogists in London. When thinking about this talk, I'm minded of the maxim drummed into me by our former librarian, Sue Gibbons, that place takes precedence, which is how we think about the arrangement and cataloguing of the Society's resources, as those relating to the places where our ancestors lived are probably the most useful. And I think for researchers, there are fundamental questions when thinking about family history. Who were they? What did they do? When did they live? And where? And for the All About That Place event today, we're primarily concerned with the sources relating to where our ancestors lived. A search in the online library catalogue of the Society of Genealogists shows 41 items selected and held in the library relating to Whitstable in Kent, where I live, which can be equally useful for genealogy or local history. We have church registers and associated parish records. We have facsimiles and transcripts of local records, such as manorial court documents from the 18th and 19th century, the 1641 protestation returns, monumental inscriptions from the local churchyard. We have several published local histories, quite a few maps, directories from the 18th to the 20th century, poll books, etc. Local history illuminates our research. For example, why can't you find that marriage? Understanding the local community and its mores will help. While London provided many opportunities for a quick illicit union, there are also many rural and provincial parishes renowned for performing clandestine or irregular marriages. Local knowledge can feed into working your way round genealogical brick walls. The late 17th century saw an increasing number of parishes in unexpected places that claimed freedom from the bishops. In St James Duke's Place between 1664 and 1691, there are some 40,000 marriages recorded in the registers, far more than you'd expect for a parish of its size in the City of London. So many that in 1686, the rector of St James Duke's Place was suspended for 3 years for undertaking marriages without banns or licence. Other notable London marriage hotspots include Holy Trinity Minories, St Botolph's Aldgate, the area around the Tower of London and the Mint. But the most notorious of these marrying places was the area known as the Liberty of the Fleet, near the Fleet Prison in Farringdon. Some 250,000 marriages are recorded there. Parishes that I know of that perform clandestine or irregular marriages outside London include Fledborough in Nottingham, where between 1712 and 1728, only 6 marriages are noted in the parish registers. But after the arrival of the rector William Sweetapple, some 488 marriages by licence appear in the registers from 1728 to 1754, as he notoriously abused his position by issuing a licence to marry to pretty much anybody who wanted or paid him. At Dale Abbey in Derbyshire, the curate conducted weddings at a shilling a couple, and the vicar of Tong in Kent was brought before the Canterbury Consistory Church Court in 1667, having dishonoured my ministry by a constant and habitual course and practice of marrying all sorts of people, both of my own and other parishes, without banns or licence. You may need supplementary evidence to that found in local parish registers which record baptisms, marriages and burials. The Society of Genealogists has a transcription of the monumental inscriptions recorded from local headstones in the churchyard of the parish of Llandinarbo, compiled by the Herefordshire Family History Society in the 1980s. Amongst these MIs is a note of a decorated headstone with an inscription enclosed in an oval panel that reads, "In memory of Anne Churchill, buried the 7th of July, 1716, aged 41. But this burial is not recorded in the published burial registers of the parish of Llandinarbo, nor in the original parish registers, nor in neighbouring parishes, as I've checked the film copies we hold in the Society's library. I do have a baptism record in a neighbouring parish that might fit with Anne, but so far the MI is the only evidence I have for her death and burial." Where there's money, there are accounts and records. The parish vestry appointed its parish officers, such as overseers of the poor, churchwardens and constables. Here you can see the income and expenses recorded by the churchwardens of the parish of Morpeth. Income from legacies and rentals supplemented the poor rate that covered the weekly expenses for the support of named poor parishioners, and the accounts here show how long the parishioners had been in receipt of relief from the parish. Those who owned or rented property to a sufficient value were liable to pay the parish poor rate to finance expenditure on matters such as poor relief. The ratepayers who owned property and their tenants who paid sufficient rent were listed, such as shown here in our copy of the assessment of ratepayers who paid the poor rates in the parish of Deal in Kent in 1821. While women property owners and renters couldn't vote in parliamentary elections, they did pay rates and could, in some places, vote in local elections. Portsea Island's rate books on Find My Past include thousands of women, as can be seen here, for the returns of Warblington Street in Portsea in 1740 to 1741. From them, it is possible to establish when a house is first occupied, and as the rate returns for towns are often arranged by streets, local rate books can sometimes be more comprehensive than contemporary trade directories, which are seldom arranged by street until the mid-19th century. In 1744, an act gave residents the right to inspect rate books, and hence more records may survive from this date. Local directories are lists of people. From the point of view of a genealogist, they're flourishing in a certain time and place. The earliest directory is considered to be a list of London merchants dating from 1677. Essentially, directories were started to provide information for and about traders and merchants in big cities and expanded to cover provincial towns and the counties at large. In the early years, small rural parishes may not be covered, but this changes by the mid-19th century, and street directories were added to about this time too. As more people are listed, local trade directories can help to identify people at a certain time and place, with information about where they lived and what they did. You're unlikely to find working class people who did not work for themselves, such as agricultural labourers and servants, etc., but you will find the people they worked for, the artisans, traders, professional persons, and land and property owners. Land and property ownership inferred voting rights. The 1696 Act that introduced published poll books was designed to prevent fraud by showing how electors had voted. Here we can see a printed poll book listing those freeholders and those who rented property to a sufficient value who voted for the Knights of the Shire to represent the county of Leicestershire in the parliamentary elections of 1775. The rights to vote in the borough of Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire lay with all householders. Aylesbury is what is colloquially known as a potwalloper borough. Anyone with a pot could vote. These voters in the 1804 poll book are not wealthy landowners. Rather, they are basket makers, labourers, bricklayers, victuallers and gardeners, etc. So it's worth investigating the circumstances of the constituencies where your ancestors lived and voted to see what other avenues or records you might pursue. Land and property give you rights, such as voting, but also responsibilities. Here's another name-rich list of Middlesex freeholders noted in the jurors' list for Osselton Hundred in the county of Middlesex. It gives names, occupations, and the street where they lived. You can see John Hebble, the gardener of Pennington Road, or James Aspinall, the cheesemonger of Ratcliffe Highway. And the 9th entry down is for Samson Tasker, a lighterman of Hermitage Street. And I can cross-refer him to local land tax records for the same hundred. Paying land tax is another responsibility. These jurors' lists are dying out to be indexed online. They're most certainly worth looking for in 18th and early 19th century quarter session records. Interestingly, those freeholder jurors' lists for the county of Surrey have gone online, and we can see that in Southwark, St Thomas, John Neatby, a leather dresser, is noted as a Quaker, and hence presumably would be ineligible to sit on a jury because he would refuse to take the oath required before serving. Genealogists are taught to use the FAN method of weighing up genealogical connections. FAN stands for family, associations, and neighbours. So identify extended family members, siblings, cousins, etc. Gain evidence about those they associated with, such as employers or fellow churchgoers, and of course look at their neighbours in the communities where they lived. The Churchills and Vaughans lived next door to each other for many years. William Churchill Sr. and James Vaughan, the rat catcher, were near neighbours in St Leonard's in 1861. A generation earlier, in the 1841 census, we can find Richard Vaughan, father of James the rat catcher, living next door to James and Martha Churchill, parents of William, in Penrose Green in St Leonard's, and other Vaughans and Churchills are noted around the village. The addresses in the census are ambiguous, with most of the agricultural labourers living in small tenement households and cottages with no street names. The tithe maps and apportionment records at the National Archives were compiled in the 1840s and can supplement the censuses with more detail and show exactly where the cottage and garden occupied by James Churchill was situated, and also the tenements and gardens occupied by his neighbour, Richard Vaughan, and his son Noah. Noah Vaughan went on to marry James's daughter Martha, the girl next door. The intermarriage and associations between the Churchills and the Vaughans in this area can be identified over 200 years. Maps and censuses and tithe records means I can today find the actual Penrose cottages where they lived, the Churchills on the right and the Vaughans on the left. My humble ancestors do appear quite a lot in the local newspapers. They don't have much worth stealing, but they were victims of and witnesses to theft and petty crimes and some more serious incidents too. I've identified my Churchills by searching by name together with place in online newspapers and other contemporary records. I can follow stories of the Churchills in the St. Wentworth village and neighbouring parishes in Herefordshire for 40 years, from 1839 until they moved to Wales. I've established where they lived and worked and who for. I've seen the Churchills appear as witnesses in various court proceedings. I've seen them act as good neighbours and also be fined for letting loose farmyard animals out into the road. I've identified other cottages from exact addresses as they finally become enfranchised themselves by electoral reforms and are listed in electoral rolls from 1884. I've seen them apply for maintenance of their illegitimate offspring and make affiliation orders against feckless fathers. The clues offered by a place of settlements in settlement examinations and certificates generated after the Settlement Act of 1662 are invaluable for family historians, going back into the 18th century, showing as they do the place of settlement, which could be their parish of birth, or where they served an apprenticeship, or worked for a year, or owned property, or rented property to a sufficient value. And hence, certificates might suggest clues about migration. Here's a settlement certificate for Daniel Martin and his family. And interestingly, the certificate shows the story from both ends of his migration, from the copy issued by the overseers of Fordingbridge in Hampshire and the copy lodged with the overseers in the parish of Merrywith in Kent, where he settled. Copies of the certificates can be found in both the Winchester and Maidstone record offices. John Pantry seems to have moved about even more. The Canterbury Consistory Church Court depositions or witness statements record the name, the age, and ask where the witness came from and how long they'd lived in various places. In 1600, he tells us that during his 25 years, John Pantry has lived in 15 places. Smith, Stouting, Limage, Flanders, Sevington, Dymchurch. He was at sea. He'd lived in Elam, Kennington, Elmstead, Limney, Newchurch, Bilsington, Barham, Newchurch, because that's where he was born, Bonington. And as you can see, his life is definitely all about the place.